Welcome to Season 5 of the Photoethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 3, we'll be talking with Raymond Thompson Jr. about speculation. Raymond is an interdisciplinary artist, visual journalist, and assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin. His academic journey includes an MFA in photography from West Virginia University, an MA in journalism from the University of Texas at Austin, and a degree in American Studies from the University of Mary Washington. Raymond explores how race, memory, representation, and place combine to shape the Black environmental imagination of the North American landscape. Raymond has collaborated with renowned organizations such as the New York Times, NPR, the Associated Press, and many others. His work has been exhibited in numerous exhibitions. He won the 1619 Aftermath Grant in 2023 and the Lens Scratch Student Prize in 2021. His work is held in the permanent collection of the Museum of Contemporary Photography, the Virginia Museum of Fine Art, and the Ogden Museum of Southern Art. Raymond is the author of Appalachian Ghost, published in 2024 by the University Press of Kentucky. Can we just start with you telling us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
I am sort of a mixed bag. I do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. That's not true. But I think right now, at this point in my process in my career, a lot of the work I do kind of falls in this sort of archival, historic space. I like to look at the threads in history that's surrounding African Americans. Then I like to go to the very ends of those threads, and I like to tease them out and create the connections between them, sort of start to weave in the stories that exist in that space. Almost like we call myself like sort of like a speculative documentarian at this point, if that makes sense. And that work is really driven around this idea of looking for the threads of the African-American body in the American landscape, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And your background, you sort of started off in photojournalism, is that correct? And then you've moved more into an arts practice. Am I correctly representing that? And can you elaborate on that a little?
Oh yeah, totally. So I started off, really, really interested in just photography. But my parents were like, you need to get a job, son. And I was like, all right, so what can I do with a camera? And one of my first models for that was a photojournalist. So at some point, and I knew I really liked photographing people, like being out in the world. So at some point I began, even before I finished my photo education, I took like photo 1, darkroom, photo 2. At that point, I realized that I really wanted to be a photographer, but I didn't know what kind of photographer I wanted to be. But life was happening at the same time. I was trying to figure out where I wanted to go in the world. My parents wanted to charge me rent, and I was like, I'm not going to pay rent. I'm going to move to Chicago. Take that. And when I got there, I really sort of fell into the photojournalism space. I took a class at Columbia College in Chicago. And had the fortune of learning from John White, who was a Sun-Times photographer at the time, and I was really inspired by him and his practice. And that made me really wanted to become a photojournalist. So I spent the next probably decade attempting to become a photojournalist. Eventually, I landed at a couple of papers, community papers in Northern Virginia. And that's where sort of I started in that space, working as a newspaper photographer. And from there, I, did all the things you can do as a newspaper photographer. I shot everything imaginable. And I feel like it was like the best education for me to start photographing in spaces. I worked in a lot of rural spaces too, which is really interesting. And I'm reflecting a lot on now, like what that meant to be African-American working in rural Virginia, where oftentimes I was the only Black person around anywhere in space. And even how I was able to sort of like become a ninja in my head to navigate those spaces. now that when I'm thinking about that now. But anyway, so from that point on, I did that for a number of years. But at some point, I know I wanted to change how I approach my work. And because I sort of had dropped out of college multiple times while I was on this way to become a photojournalist, because I never actually finished anything for a long time. I became a photojournalist before I even finished school. And because of that, like I wanted to go back to get my degree. And I went back to get an American Studies degree. And that really changed how I approach my work and how I looked at like what a photograph can do.
That's super interesting. I'm always really fascinated to hear the different ways in that people take and or ways through that people take. I guess your experience in sort of photojournalism, but then also with your American Studies degree very much plays into sort of the work that you're doing now.
Yes. Oh yeah. It is the base of how I see the world. I'm very much a storyteller. And sometimes when I'm in art spaces and I like start talking about, I almost when I say story, I mean art or vice versa. It's like go back and forth and always about this idea of looking at the landscape for stories, which sometimes like gets me in trouble in art spaces. It's like because I'm like story. No, I meant art because some people are really into that idea of capital A art. And I'm like, it's just, another way of communicating something from me out to the world. But yeah, so American Studies, because of the nature of degree at the time where I took it, it was a very interdisciplinary degree. Like I was taking classes all over the university, from like literature to sociology to history to within American Studies. And I think that really formed my approach to my work, these multiple ways of getting into a story and trying to think about them together on the same level, as if they're all sort of related in some way.
I feel like that comes through even in sort of the very different types of methods that you use in your work. I was, just in looking on your website, it looks like you've really experimented and harnessed a wide range of what's the word I'm looking for? Not approaches,
I mean,
methods.
it is approaches, it's methods,
Hmm.
it's ideas, it's coming from all over the place. Sometimes I like when people are gonna look at my website, I'm like, all right, you're gonna see a lot of stuff. It's gonna be come from all different directions. In photojournalism, when I was a photojournalist, I spent years trying to harness the form of photography. Like, how do I make a picture to differentiate myself, to have authorship? With my images. And I did that for years. So I would be like, I'm going to do it differently. So people will be able to see that I do it differently. And that's going to make my work a sell amongst other works. Right. But at some point, I realized that was fallacy for me. And I was much more motivated by content over form. And that began to be all informing for me. So everything I do, like literally the story or the content informs my approach.
Absolutely. No, I think that really comes through. Like I'm thinking in particular about the chlorophyll prints that you did. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, but I particularly liked that.
Yeah, so the cool for Prince, yeah, it's the project is called The Trauma of White Light. And in that project, I basically, well, it was my COVID project. It's like, and I had entered grad school and I just finished a big chunk of major work for my first half of my graduate course. And they're like, you can't do that anymore, do something else. And I was really fascinated by this idea of exploring my grandfather's connection to the Southern landscape, like trying to understand where his roots were. And I started off by looking at the Library of Congress because I really wanted to know what his life looked like in 1930s North Carolina. And I found this whole collection in the Library of Congress in the FSA archive. It's had like Dorothea Lange, Marion Post Walcott, photographers like that who all had spent time making images in North Carolina. And I was using those images to try to understand like myself and my family's connection to the landscape. But you really realize the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, is a deeply political archive and had a purpose. And it was the reason why it was created. And African Americans play a certain type of role within that archive. They're meant to do a certain thing within that space. And I've always found that to be odd and kind of not corrupt, but I find it to be problematic in a way. Me, especially having to use this certain vision of African Americans to try to understand myself and my connection to the landscape. So I had that idea, these images, and I did some family oral histories to figure out like what did my family know or remember about my grandfather's life in North Carolina. Like what were the oral histories about it? And one of the few things I found was like everyone believed that he worked in cotton fields or worked with tobacco. And at that point, so I really started to focus on cotton and tobacco. And because I was in grad school, and that's what grad students do, I ordered some seedlings of tobacco and I put them in pots in my front yard. And I began growing tobacco with no intention of what I was going to do with them. I just knew I needed tobacco. I need to see what tobacco looks like, how it grows. And they grew full size, and I got some massive tobacco leaves. And I was like, what do I do with these leaves? And I began to play with collages, like with fresh leaves. At some point, someone pointed me to Ben Dong's work, his chlorophyll work in Vietnam. And then I sort of found a way to use this archival imagery that I found from the FSA and combine them with the plants that I grew and make chlorophyll prints. And chlorophyll printing, if y'all don't know, is essentially it's like using like plant matter to and either contact printing a negative on top and using the sun to expose the chlorophyll within the plant, and it will hold an image on it. Kind of like when you leave a garden hose on a lawn for a couple of days and you pick that up, you get that bleaching. The same thing happens on the plant. Like the chlorophyll printing was trying to get me through trying to understand this archive. I'm trying to understand myself, and then also at the same time wondering like, what does a tobacco plant look like? What does it smell like? What is it like to pick the bugs off that you get when you have that experience of actually growing the thing? In some way, it was its own little performance that I did for myself. Essentially, I actually did document it, but I haven't shared that documentation with anyone on video. Maybe one day I will. But so that was part of the process. And lumen printing was like the second part of that, in which I was really started to dig in. I was having issues with the images, the Dorothea Lange images, the Marion Post Walcott images, because they all show African Americans in labor and working. And I began thinking a lot about why are all these images about working? Very little images that shows anything about intimate family life in that archive, right? But again, this archive had a specific purpose. And I began like, why am I? And then the project I just finished, my Appalachian Ghost project, was all about labor and showing Black bodies laboring again. And I was like, wow, what does this mean? What am I doing? So at that point, I began thinking about, visibility. And I think I read an article about Taju Cole, who quotes Edward Glissant's ideas about visibility. And I got really inspired to sort of think about like the right to be seen or not to be seen within photographs. And I created that image set, which is the project is called Playing in the Dark, which is a reference to my Toni Morrison story. And I essentially made these self-portrait lumen prints of my own body, and I split tone the lumen prints with selenium, and sort of to create these abstractions on paper of my body that are really hard to see sometimes. Some are more clear, some have some color, using lumen printing process, and really just to abstract my own body and to make something a beautiful object that's alluring, but also that demands that the viewer look harder.
I think you've brought up a point in all of this that we haven't really talked about on the podcast. Like some people have talked a bit about using archives and, the different challenges that we can encounter when we're using archives. But I think you picked up specifically on the issues with archival representation. And I don't know if we've really dug into that very much in past episodes. And I'm not really articulating a question, but I think that when you're talking about like the FSA archive being created for a specific purpose, that's something that we can really lose sight of a lot of times. I think we forget that these archives are there to do a thing. They're not this sort of omniscious body of work that shows us all the facets of life.
Yeah, they are not. I mean, my project Appalachian Ghost uses the archive created by a subsidiary of Union Carbide, which is now Dow. And that company made it to document that process. And people just happen to get caught in that process in those images, right? And course, and then looking at FSA archive, that was made to sort of to help to be a propaganda piece to help the Congress provide support for the New Deal. And so that archives always have a reason and purpose. But the cool thing is, artists, we get to flip it. We get to challenge it, and we get to try to point at some of the flaws within it. And all my work has always been based on some sort of archival material. At first, it started off very visual archival materials, and then most recently, I've gone into actually text archival materials. But as I try to go further back in time, when the photographs simply aren't there. Like one of the problems with why I was doing the work with the FSA archive was that it was only showing me workers. And I wanted to know those other moments, those other things that happened that aren't really caught in traditional archives. They may be in family histories, but those are much harder to access if they exist at all. And my family doesn't have any of that stuff. So having to use like speculation as a tool, especially around text documents. And I really did it a lot in my most current project, is Hard to Stop Rebels That Time Travel, which the main archival material there is runaway slave ads and a little bit of African-American folklore.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean when you say that you use speculation as a tool?
So basically, it's like being trained as a journalist, like you always sort of rely heavily on facts, right? And facts are great, and facts are how we all have an initial understanding of a thing. But at some point, facts stop being effective by themselves. A fact can only take me up to a point. And as a journalist, you're trained that once the fact stops, story stops. Like you can't go any further with that. So as photojournalist, I couldn't I could go, if I wanted to understand my grandfather's story, I'd have to go find the documents, maybe try to interview some folks who understood what it was like, that they could give me a fact about his life. But there's so many gaps. And it's because the nature of the Black experience in the United States, which is complicated, and there's a lot going on in that space, that there are a lot of gaps. And normally, because of those gaps in factual information, we would have to stop and it wasn't important or something. But in order, I think, for me, when I say I'm using those threads, I'm finding all these threads that are sort of hanging off the same quilt. They look disparate, they're different colors, but I'm trying to use that speculation to imagine the spaces in between the threads, to build the world in those spaces that's hanging off of that quilt, right? I'm not coming up with I'm not making up stories. I'm taking the evidence to the very end, and then I am just trying to create the possible connections between those threads.
I think that's really, really interesting. And I think that in some ways you can, that you can think about that as an ethical practice as well, right? Like the fact that that work isn't there. And if we don't take a speculative approach, it will never be there. And those stories will never be told and we'll never have.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? Because again, looking at the archive, specifically looking at runaway slave ads, as they function, and even lynching articles in a way, but I'll start with the runaway slave ads. The runaway slave ads are very, they're kind of formulaic at times. They start in a certain kind of way. There's always just somebody with a name has run away from the subscriber during this time. Sometimes there then will be these descriptions, these who these people are, what they look like potentially, any weird tics they might have, sometimes clothing they might have been wearing. And I really love to focus on those tics where someone's this person is this, or this person, if you accuse them of something, their face is going to wrinkle. I'm that's so wild. So wild as idea. And I'm supposed to believe the person who has never been in bondage and is searching for this person's account of who this person is. Right. So for me, just looking at those ads and then, trying to figure out ways to work with them. And my practice, they have two purposes. One is I use them as is to sort of point me to the locations in the landscape today of where to go and visit. In the other way, I use them directly. I actually insert my own thoughts into the ad, which I think are just as valuable as the subscribers' thoughts back in the day, because I think they're just as random. But it's like, inserting my searching also too for these people in these landscapes, and my wondering about how they move through this space became two ways in which those I'm approaching using these runaway slave ads. I also use the lynching articles, but less so. I more use the lynching articles for locations, ways to understand like other spaces to visit to that I kind of look at as important spaces within the landscape that need to be marked in some way. But the lynching articles also too have this very specific pattern that they work, and they work in a very specific way. The first way was to, generally to mark the outrage of the community, to mark it as a community outrage. And normally, especially if the person was lynched, well, the person when the person is lynched is a community doing. The headlines are always like, 1,000 bullets pierce this person. Like, it's always a community act. It's a righteous act. And at the very end of the articles, they always go and they ask the Black community, do you agree with this lynching? And normally they have some sort of agreement from the community which lost a member too. It's very formulaic.
And what kinds of challenges, I guess, have you faced when you're working with archival material or developing projects about historical events?
Oh, so many. It's so hard because I'm using photography, which is a medium that's very much in the present, and trying to create the slippage between the past, present, and future with an image that's really focused on the moment. So you look at a landscape, and like the landscape doesn't move on. The landscape looks nothing like it looked 100 years ago. For me, like especially driving around the North Carolina countryside, you see cotton, tobacco, and corn, but the fields are like 1,000 acres big, which is not what it would have been back in the day, right? These are 1,000 acre spaces that like people are farming for like big corporations now. And so you're trying to figure out this way of how do you look at this landscape and sort of invoke this feeling of the past in that way. So it's always a really super difficult thing, especially coming from my training as being a photojournalist. I've been trained to photograph moments, 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 moments. It's the thing that we do. It's the thing I've done most of my career, is searching for these peak action images to live in newsprint. And then to go look at the story of the past, I've had to learn to look softer at the landscape, learn not looking for moments, but looking for something that may be more spiritual way of connecting to that landscape. And for me, that big experience was, it was raining one day. I didn't want to go out, and I decided to go out in the rain to attempt to make these landscape pictures. And because I did that, I began to see how the landscape had changed. I'd see reflections of light that were being offered to me, and I began to look at those as offerings in some way, or things I was getting from the scape. And I was okay. There's something happening in this space. There's these points of transitions between time, maybe. And from that point, I sort of began to use this framework of the portal, right? And that the framework of the portal is the thing that was pulling me through that work. So I think the hard thing with archives is finding a framework for me to make all the materials kind of be glued together loosely for that moment. So that is the challenge, because you're using such different materials that are all over the place, and trying to find a way that they connect, trying to find a way in which you want to reposition them to help people see things slightly differently with the work, or to create a space for them to enter the work. I think it's a really challenging part of all that, actually. Maybe something even now, as I try to move forward, I'm like, oh, here are all these materials in space again. Like, what do I do with this? It's like, but that is like the part of the work of the artist, the work of the storyteller, is to try to find entry points or ways in to a project that don't cut people off from understanding or sort of push them out, but invite them in to have their own understandings of this process as well.
I guess as well, like when you're using archival material that is like highly violent, when you're using really violent historical material as well, like how do you navigate that, both in terms of how you use it, but also the fact, I don't know, the challenge that you're relying on something so rooted in injustice and racism and really difficult histories, and transforming that I don't know. Again, I'm not really asking a very clear question, but it makes me think a little bit about, how we use things and making sure that we're not, I don't know. I don't know.
No, are you doing more harm than good with your work by like naming folks? Like I, for a while, I've been struggling with this. One thing is so specifically the lynching images. They're just these usually they're a landscape picture of a lynching site. And because I found it off a website that had GPS coordinates, and that was my how I just went to the place. So the title of the images are GPS coordinate along with the names of the people lynched in that location. And I battled with should I include the names in that title? Because I figured that people would see the GPS coordinates, they may recognize that, but they didn't know that something happened in this space. So you would see this landscape picture, you would see a title that has GPS coordinates and just names, and that's it. Like I don't say lynched. But I did battle with should I even put their names on the titles? Was I like doing those folks injustice or families injustice by doing that? But ultimately, I decided to leave the names in the image, and because I felt that in some ways that because the spaces are all unmarked, I didn't want to leave it unmarked because people are passing walking over these bridges, passing these fields all the time, and they have no clue what happened in these spaces. And I want to mark the spaces, and essentially I want to say their name, so people will understand what happened in this space. Again, I'm not like necessarily people have to want to investigate. They have to want to do the work with that. Like GPS coordinate name, you go Google that and find all about it if you want to, but I'm leaving it open to the viewer to decide to do that or not.
That's really interesting project. It reminds me a lot of some of the work that's happened in Northern Ireland since the Troubles as well. I'm thinking of like Paul Seawright did a project about sites. It's called Sectarian Murder, and it's sites where people had been murdered in a sectarian event, and he pulls the newspaper article but takes out any community identifiers. So it's sort of, he doesn't name people though. So I think that's really interesting, the different ways that artists negotiate that and for different contexts decide what is or isn't appropriate as well. I think that's really interesting. And there was something that you mentioned as well about like, how it can be quite like a spiritual or meditative, but you didn't say meditative. I think you said spiritual practice of sort of this speculative documentary or the landscape work that you were doing as well. And I feel like I harp on about this in every episode, so I do apologize, but I can't not say that it also sounds like there's an element of time there. Like, of course, there's time because you're looking at archives and like slippage in time, but as well, like the time that it takes to have a spiritual experience in a new place. You don't get out of the car and you say, oh, this is it. Like, maybe I'm wrong.
No. I drove every single road in those counties. So I was working in this 3-county area, and I think I drove every single road at least twice, 2 or 3 times. And it was weird because the practice was, in some ways, it was very much tied to my photojournalistic way of looking at spaces, like moving through in my car, stopping and like waiting for a moment to be attracted to a thing to stop and to want to look at it again. But I think ultimately, like it took me about 2 or 3 trips before I found the way in which I wanted to approach the space. Enabled myself to find value in making landscape photographs coming from a photojournalistic space where we're like, landscapes, that's boring. So once I found a way to look at the space, also even beginning to think about the land holding, the land is a space that's holding these bones. I think even on the first trip, and I didn't realize that at the time, I hadn't met one of the big reasons I'm doing this project is because my family is from that landscape specifically. Forgot to mention that. Like I did the Leaf project, the chlorophyll printing project, and then I actually went to the space where my grandfather was from and began to work in that space. So literally, like there's family bones in that ground somewhere, or not, probably not bones, probably dust at this point. But I was a fourth cousin who I didn't even know had pointed me to a family burial site. It's like the only one I've actually found when I've been down there. There was an unmarked space. Like it was a graveyard, had the, it's a southern graveyard, had a live oak, huge live oak in the middle. A beautiful space sitting in the middle of one of these 1,000-acre agricultural fields. So you had to know where it was to get there. And then in the very back, of the cemetery was like these little indentions in the ground. It's hard to see them unless the light's a certain kind of way. It happened to be that it's like one of these spaces that probably had rained and the water had settled there and the grass is growing slightly longer in that space. And I was making a picture of that. Um, and of course, shooting film. And when I went back home to develop the film, I accidentally opened the can and let light in. And I'm like, no, oh no. And sort of and closed it back up. But those light leaks actually are really quite beautiful on the film. They kind of like blare across it. And I was like, well, this feels like that was like something made me do that. It's like something helped like make this image. Something was trying to communicate with me in in those ancestral spaces, right? Um, in other ways, and I spent a lot of time looking for the graves of family members, or just looking for last names. If I see a cemetery, I stop and look for the Kennedy last name or something. I never found much. Not to say they're not there, but I haven't found them yet. But I read stories about like how Black bodies are treated if you died and you were poor and Black in the space during slavery. Like they didn't bury you. Like if you didn't have a family or church like to bury you, you just got tossed to the side, right? Your body just ended up in the landscape. Your body became part of that landscape. And in that way, I think I had to learn to look at the space as a spiritual space, an ancestral space, because some of these people their sets will never be found, right? And it's a swampy area, so there's water in that ground. So something in the ground is going to return back to dust very quickly. So in some way, I had to like sort of get more in touch with this idea of the ancestors and its connection to space. It was the reason why I also allowed my space to even do the work in the first place, because I had this sort of connection to it. Like I asked myself the question, what right do I have to do this story in this place? Like, why am I here? And for me, it was this connection to this space. Like, I mean, you could do this. I could do this story anywhere in America where there's slavery, basically. But I chose to do it specifically in a space that I had some blood kinship connection to.
And when you're doing work that is personal and that does connect to family stories, like how do you navigate that? Like, especially if you're collecting oral histories from family members. You know, I think I've talked with some other artists about this, about how like it can be quite difficult to get consent from family because they're just very supportive and they don't really pay attention to the T's and C's. You know, they just say yes. Yeah.
No, yeah, but in a good way. Like I haven't, like I've used my family to point me in direction, but I actually haven't used their materials in my work at all. I wanted to, and I still haven't because I got some great information about my grandfather. But because initially the project was about him, but very quickly the project left that space. One reason was because the trail was so short for him in this space, and my family's understanding. Like I could only find information on death certificates, and even though that information is suspect because people are writing things down when they're grieving, and dates. So you have these general person born about this time, born in this space, and that's it. But those are the only records we have to trace back, and also some like not slave schedule stuff, but the census documents too that have a little bit of information, like as to how many of them there were. But also was really feeling weird about why I was only focusing on the patriarch. I wasn't paying attention to women in that space, and that didn't seem right to me. And I wanted to expand away to the grandmothers and the matriarchs as well as these spaces, who are just if not more important for like family in these spaces. So, and because of that, I sort of like I started off very narrow and I kind of rotated out to a much wider telling of a story in that space. And that didn't focus just on the one patriarchal looking at the landscape there. Because even my family stories are very masculine understandings of him in that space. That sometimes the both violent stories, the tellings of his space. So how we understand our grandfather is in that masculine patriarchal lens. And I wanted to attempt to spread beyond that if I could.
No, that's really interesting. And what, like through all this work, I guess, first of all, where is it seen? Like, where are you exhibiting this work, or what forms is it taking? And what's your intention with that?
Yeah. So my intention Because I'm finding because of my process and all of these materials, photographs, archival documents, um, text, and also archival documents that I want to like sometimes in art practice I'm like changing them, but most of that sometimes I just want to take the actual archival document and let it live next to my art and be in conversation with each other. The best place for this has been the book. Um, and the book is where I've been focusing the work on first most of the time. Like the Appalachian Ghost book I just published is that way, but that book was also shown in exhibitions before, but never completely in the way that I really want to. And the book was the first time where everything was together. The current work is also meant to be a book, and I think I signed the contract for that, and that'll be published in 2025 as the book. But I'm also currently trying to figure out ways how to display the work, which has been a challenge so far. So I've had a couple exhibitions of the work, and each time I'm like, that kind of works. Kind of want to do a little bit differently next time. So it's a growing stage of how to exhibit the work. I'm exhibiting like prints on the wall first, the prints behind glass and like black frames. Um, the runaway slave ads that I've changed are like in light boxes on the wall, and I kind of like the light box thing. I might keep that for now because when I got a chance to see someone looking at them, I love how they like because I'm a sort of like burying the original text a little bit and popping out my words with these light boxes, people like are really digging into them and like in a deep way. Like, and I kind of love that. Like, I actually took a picture of this dude like staring at my box for like a solid 2 minutes, like as he read that text. And I was like, that maybe that's like, I felt really accomplished at that moment that it did its job, which was I just wanted to engage people with a thing. I don't know how they feel about it or whatever, but it's like usually these big 30 by 40 prints, different sizes. I have portraits as well. And the portraits are also a challenging thing for me. I've kind of moved away, at least right now, my practice in photographing people, especially Black people, using a camera to photograph Black people at all. I don't really want to that much anymore. Even though I love portraiture, I love portraiture. Like I love it so much. like, I love a good photograph of a person, but I find it challenging to do now because of the nature of photography and Black bodies. It's just so complex. It's so complicated. Like I mean, and people might think I'm crazy, but like in general, like Black folks talk about W. Du Bois' idea of double consciousness, but there's a doubleness that gets assigned to Black people, and I like all the things you love about photo. This is one of the reasons why I kind of walked. I didn't walk away from photojournalism. I still practice it occasionally. I guess this is all the reasons why photojournalism has left me being like a part of my main practice is because of the way Black people are kind of viewed in media, in my attention, right? So, I mean, you see a Black person in a picture, like there's so much historical stuff going on that skin that's just attached automatically. Like they're not people. Like they're not seen in that way first, right? Like not given the benefit of the doubt. Like all the baggage of being Black is assigned to that skin through that photograph, in my opinion. And because of that, like I've sort of has tried to move away from it. If I do show it, I'm going to do so in a way that makes the viewer work. When I portraits in a project, my current project are these, deeply dark images where the faces are almost more landscapes at that point. I literally play with the idea of having their names in the image of the actual sitters. They're all from the counties that I'm working on my current project, but I'm actually moving to a space of just calling them untitled. Like I really don't want to like the project was so about me and not about them. It's about me looking at them, but I didn't want to put any of my values on them necessarily. If that makes sense, I wanted it to be like I wanted to be me looking at the details of their face, but that's all that is. Like don't want to make any other presumptions about who these people are. And for people who want to look at that, still have to work to see it. um, so like, and that happened in the current project, that happened in my lumen printing project, this idea of making people work to see. But I have I have this relationship with the Black figure in photography now that I'm kind of trying to figure out what to do with. But currently I'm not, like, I want to hint at it, but I don't want to do the thing that's been done in the past. Because I think photography has failed, not as a medium, or our understanding of Black people or people of color. It's just too much baggage on those images, and we need a different way of looking at them.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And I really, really love the idea that you said about like making people work for it. I think that that's really interesting. And I think that really, I mean, definitely comes through in the Lumen prints. And I look forward to seeing your new work as well in 2025. Is there anything that I should have asked you but didn't?
No, I don't. I keep thinking about like why I even went down this road in the first place because I was deeply into. I'll just mention real quick, like before I applied for my MFA, it was 2016, and I was just finished up this project called Justice Undone, which was sort of looking at the prison industrial complex, but through the lens of families who are sort of left behind when loved ones are taken to prison, like just trying to figure out like what happens to a community in which you take out so many bodies out of. And around that time, I was doing my traditional photo J work, documentary work, and documenting these families' life, like sort of trying to use the camera's ability to create empathy for other people's understanding of people. And that's about when, and then like, Donald Trump gets elected and I sort of lose my stuff for a minute. And like, I kind of like started looking for other ways to do it because I felt like my images weren't doing anything. Like nothing has changed of all this work I'm doing. Like, why am I still trying to use the empathy of a certain class of people who's going to see my images as a tool for them to understand us? And I really like that's one of the big reasons why I spent out going into this other fine art space, looking for other ways to work was that disconnect for me between traditional documentary and photojournalism, and that role of empathy in the image, especially like I've been the question if like Black people can be photographic with empathy at all. And that was the thing that pushed me to look for other ways to do it.
And sort of on the back of that question, what advice would you have for anybody who is maybe interested in transitioning from a experience or career in photojournalism and more into art practice?
That's so deep.
Sorry.
I mean, it's sometimes I wonder too if I was ever really meant to be a photojournalist or because my parents said I can't be an artist. I went to journalism as a place where I saw I could kind of have both of both worlds a little bit. And because I have always been super curious, I'm super into looking at stuff from the cloud down of the world. Maybe that's the Aquarius in me. And the way I look at these spaces and interesting in these connections between things. For me, and now understanding like the role of a journalist is to tell the story of the day, that wasn't enough for me. Like I needed to understand this connection throughout time and then possibilities into the future. So if you're interested in seeing like what else could storytelling do, like how does it feed into the past and the future, I think it's definitely this really interesting way to make that transition. But not everyone is that curious, honestly. I mean, some folks just want to, you know, run on and do the work of being a photojournalist or like do the work of being present for like those things, like which is super addictive, by the way. It's like I try to explain to people how much I loved being present. I probably love being present for things more than I loved actually making the picture. Like, oh, I'm in history. I'm showing up. I'm there, right? So it's like a really addictive field to be in. But anyway, so but let me go back to actual advice. So I think the big thing for me has been like I look at photographs, I collect photo books, I look at a lot of documentary work, but I also spend a lot of time like reading history books. I spend a lot of time reading African American diaspora theory or whatever theory you want to read. Like now I'm all thinking about ecology, thinking about the earth and the environment. Like, and I go to other sources like outside of photography to then figure out how do I translate that back into the image. So that is like my main source of inspiration are these other types of books, like other disciplines, to give me inspiration about new ways of thinking about my own work and process. Photography is great, but it can be self-referential at times. So I say, get out of the box. go to different areas, other disciplines, read about other things, and then see how that might translate back into your own practice.
Brilliant. And the last question that I like to ask everyone is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
So much. One way it is like ethics, it's like it's the operational code of how to engage the photographer. I don't like to use the word subject, but I mean that's like the word that's drilled into me, like the subject photographer relationship, or as a more relationship or collaboration more. It's hard because photojournalism, I think the rules have changed now, but the way I was taught, it was not, it was very aggressive. Model. And now it's like, so it's that negotiation of that relationship between the photographer and the person being photographed. And that's an important relationship to work through. The other part of it for me is just simply the visual ethics, or the right to be seen or not to be seen, or representational ideas. I like to think about that a lot. Especially about gaze, male gaze, white gaze, black gaze, and how we look. Is how I think I look at it mostly. Yeah, that's how I look at ethics mostly, is through the idea of that lens, or the idea of like who's doing the looking.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Join me next week when we hear from Nikki Lees on making the invisible visible. In each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests, what does photography ethics mean to you? This is a question that everyone in the photography industry should be able to answer. That's why the Photography Ethics Center is asking you, our listeners, to commit to writing and publishing your own statement of ethics. Visit www.photoethics.org/ethics to learn more and to take the pledge committing to ethical transparency, accountability, and awareness. That's www.photoethics.org/ethics.